I am Rodney Kaipow. I'm the director of the Touchstone Map Library here at the History Center, and we really are pleased that you all can join us both here in person and via Zoom. We've got a pretty big audience that's out there virtually live, and of course they'll be able to access this whenever they like in the future. So it has kind of an evergreen quality to it. In a moment, we'll welcome best-selling author Robert Jacob. But first, I'd like to share with you the opening date of the History Center's new major exhibition, which is called Cuban Pathways. This show covers the 500-year history of a country with many ties to Tampa and Florida. Cuban Pathways opens right here at the History Center in the Wayne Thomas Gallery on Friday, February 11th. So definitely make sure you put that on your calendar. And there'll be a lot of events tied to that exhibit that will be going on for the year-long run that exhibit has. But tonight's program was made possible with the generous support of AARP Florida, the TBHC Endowment Fund at USF, and USF Libraries. Media support is provided by WUSF Public Media, so we really appreciate all of that help as well. Also, a special note to that large audience that we do have tuning in online. For the first time and going forward, we actually have the live stream available on closed captioning. And so we've got that as an added bonus for those who need it. And if you are watching live online, we ask that if you have a question, you use the Q&A feature in Zoom. That way you can type your question up, we'll see it, and then when it comes time for Q&A here for the live audience, we'll make sure that those questions are answered as well. So, and when we do the Q&A for the live folks here, I think we'll have a mic to pass around. So we want to make sure that the question is heard by not only the folks in this room, but by those who are watching it remotely as well. So a little extra layer of interest there. So Gasparilla is right around the corner. We've got the Children's Parade on Saturday and the big parade the following Saturday. So it makes perfect sense to have with us tonight's special guest, who has published several books about life on the high seas and is a living historian honored by the Florida Authors and Publishers Association in 2019 with 3 President Book Awards for his work. So please please join me in welcoming Robert Jacob.
Well, thank you. Before you go, not many of you realize this, but some of the research I have done was with the help of this gentleman, the expert, and I would like to present you with a copy of my book, and I will sign it for you right now.
Oh, wow, look at this, live theater. That's why award-winning author. Fancy pen, too.
Oh, of course. Let's see, yes, if I can get to the signature page. There you go.
I appreciate it. I'll read along.
Well, ahoy there, mates. My name is Robert Jacob, and all right. It helps when you plug in. There. So, my name is Robert Jacob. I've been a living historian since 1971. And recently, I've decided to focus in on pirates, as you can see from the various pictures there. Now, in researching my history and presentation, I realized that most of the books about pirates were incorrect. So I wrote a book, Pirates' Life in the Golden Age of Piracy, a true account of the pirates from the rise on Tortuga up through 1722. But everyone would ask me, well, what about the Florida pirates? So I had to do a sequel. And I wrote Pirates of the Florida Coast, Truths, Legends, and Myths. And I do have some of those books here today if anybody wishes to take a look at one or purchase a copy after the presentation. Now, Florida has a long association with pirates, true or imaginary, and that's very evident by that. I guess you all know what that represents. But how many of those stories are true? How many of those are total myths or just legends? We're going to explore a little bit of that today. Now, some background. The Spanish Main, which was the Caribbean, was called the Spanish Main, well, because mainly it belonged to Spain. They settled it and controlled it and considered it their own private lake. Their capital was in Santo Domingo on the island of Hispaniola, which is today the Dominican Republic. But their biggest city was Havana on the island of Cuba. Now you see those arrows? Those represent the predominant direction of the wind. Well, if you sail up along the coast of Florida, the wind is very favorable for you to leave the Caribbean. But if you try and sail through Cuba and Hispaniola, you're going straight into the wind, and that's bad for sailing ships. That was called the windward passage and was very seldom used. Most of the ships that left the Caribbean sailed right along the Florida coast. All of the treasure ships sailed right along the Florida coast. And that's why there are so many shipwrecks off the coast of Florida. Now, the first city in Florida was St. Augustine, settled by the Spanish in 1565. And it was attacked by Francis Drake in 1587. The city was totally destroyed, and Francis Drake made away with a few artillery pieces and a chest of gold coins. Well, Francis Drake was a privateer, and it's important that we all understand the difference between a pirate and a privateer. Privateers are legal pirates. They have what is called letters of marque, which is permission from one government to attack ships listed in those letters. Here's how it works. When England is at war with Spain, they give anybody letters of marque allowing them to attack Spanish shipping. It's a cheap way to fight your enemy. You don't have to pay for the ships. You don't have to pay their salary. And the privateers have to give 1/4 of everything they take back to the government. So it was a great way for governments to make a lot of money. Now, to the people that they attacked, they were all considered pirates. But when they got home, instead of being hanged, they were welcomed as heroes. Nice distinction. Francis Drake was a privateer, and that is actually a copy of his letter of marque signed by Queen Elizabeth that allowed him to attack the Spanish shipping. But the first real pirate that attacked anywhere in Florida was Robert Cyril. He was an English pirate, sometimes privateer, more often pirate, from Barbados. And he was sailing in the Caribbean on the south tip of Florida. Those two black ships are his. And he came across two Spanish merchant ships. They're the blue ships. There they go. They're going to attack him. And he captured the Spanish ships easily. And from one of the captives, he learned of a treasure trove of silver bars that were being stored at St. Augustine. He decided that was too good to pass up. He had to take them. So off he went towards St. Augustine. And on the 28th of May, 1668, he arrived with his two captured Spanish ships and his two pirate ships. Now, he sent the two Spanish ships in first because everybody would just assume they were coming to trade. Oh, they're Spanish merchant ships. They didn't know they were filled with his pirates. Then at nighttime, he sailed in with his other two ships. And when everyone was in position, there was a guy named Manuel de Monzon. He was a corporal in the Spanish army who happened to be out fishing that night at 2 in the morning. Saw the ships coming in and thought, that's odd. Those must be pirates. And he ran to the fort to try and warn everybody. But he was too late. The pirate ships opened up with a devastating broadside that smashed into buildings and may have killed the corporal. Then the pirates swarmed ashore and ran through the town of St. Augustine in a scene very typical of Hollywood movies, where they're killing anybody that gets in their way, smashing windows, taking whatever they want, being very destructive. Finally, the pirates came to the fort. And it wasn't the same fort that's there today, about half the size, but it was impressive enough that the pirates decided, this isn't worth it. We're gonna pass on the silver bars. So the next morning, they burned the town and left. They wound up only getting 133 silver marks, which is only about $36,000 in today's money. Split 300 ways, that's not very much. But they did get 720 yards of canvas and 25 pounds of candles. Candles were important back then. After Robert Cerral's attack, the Spanish decided to build the current fort that's there today, which is capable of firing upon ships in the port to prevent any future pirate attacks. Now, the War for the Spanish Succession is a war that most people don't know about. You know, when have you ever said, hey, let's go play War for the Spanish Succession? But it was almost a world war, and it took place between 1702 and 1714, primarily between Spain and France on one side, and England, the Dutch, the Germans, and the Austrians on the other side. And it was over who inherited the throne of Spain when the King of Spain died with no children. Well, early on in that war, the British defeated the Spanish soundly at the Battle of Vigo Bay. And this kind of scared the Spanish. They knew that the British had better naval power than they did. For the last couple hundred years, the Spanish had a treasure route that routinely sent treasure ships from the New World back to Spain. They all left Havana, sailed right along the Florida coast, and across the ocean. Well, they were scared that the English were going to attack it, so they decided to halt these treasure fleets. But the treasure still kept pouring in to Havana. So by 1715, the warehouses were filled with the richest treasure anybody could possibly imagine. And that was all put upon one fleet that was sailing back to Spain. On July 31st, 1715, 12 ships loaded from top to bottom with treasure were sailing along the Florida coast. Now, what happens in Florida in July? Hurricanes. Yep, you guessed it. And a big hurricane came up, and one ship got away, but the 11 other ships were dashed upon the shoals and sank. Now, out of all the ships that went down, 3 of them were salvageable, very close to Sebastian Inlet. And the Spanish brought in high-tech salvaging equipment from Cuba in order to recover a lot of the stuff from down there. Yeah, they did have diving bells and some kind of hard hat diver suits. Pretty cool. They set up a camp, a salvage camp on the beach at Sebastian Inlet to kind of catalog all the treasure they recovered and box it up for shipment back to Spain. A lot of the treasure still exists today, and these pictures are from various museums throughout Florida. But one picture in particular is from the Tampa Bay History Center, right there. So you can come and see some of that 1715 treasure fleet right here. Well, as one would figure, word got out. And an English pirate privateer named Henry Jennings, who operated out of Nassau, decided this was too good to pass up. So he sailed over to Florida. Now, that's a photograph of the actual spot where the treasure camp was located at Sebastian Inlet. He landed his men and simply walked up the beach and took everything that they had boxed up. Got away with about 60,000 pieces of eight. Sailed back to Nassau. But then he came back 3 months later, did the exact same thing. This time getting about $300,000 of pieces of eight, 300,000 pieces of eight. Which is pretty good because one piece of eight in today's money is worth about $100. So what did he do with that money? He built up Nassau as a pirate base. Nassau was kind of like a rundown, just a bunch of shacks, nothing impressive. But after Henry got there, he built it up as a real pirate town with taverns and brothels and all kinds of things that pirates would like. For a while, between 1716 and 1722, Nassau seemed to be the center of pirate activity in the Caribbean and elsewhere. And this is where most of the famous pirates like Blackbeard came from, and Charles Vane, and Jack Rackham. Well, Jack Rackham leads us to our next possible pirate in Florida. There is a tale that Jack Rackham and his lifetime girlfriend, Anne Bonny, actually honeymooned here on the west coast of Florida. Now, according to the story, in 1719, they were sailing off the south coast of Florida. That's their ship right there. And they spotted a merchant ship coming, and they thought, oh, this is a great prize. We're going to take it. But the merchant ship was well armed and let loose with a tremendous broadside that toppled their mast. So they kind of limped into the Gulf of Mexico looking for a safe island to make repairs and settled on Estero Island, which is next to Fort Myers. And while his crew was repairing the ship, according to the legend, Jack Rackham and Anne Bonny built a small shack on a nearby island and kind of had a little honeymoon going. That island is called Lover's Key in their honor. Well, is that true? I would have to say no. First of all, Lover's Key didn't get its name until the early 20th century. Apparently, high school kids used to row out to the island quite often and use it kind of like as a lover's lane. And it's a state park now. So where did this story come from? It came from one source. The history of the lives and actions of the most famous highwaymen street robbers, to which is added a genuine account of the voyages and plunders of the most noted pirates by Captain Charles Johnson. Published in 1813, 100 years almost after this incident supposedly took place. So where did he get this story, and who is Charles Johnson? Well, before we answer that, let's go back to Jack Rackham. He was actually a real pirate, well documented, and Anne Bonny and Mary Read were a member of his crew. And in 1720, they were operating a small sloop between Cuba and Jamaica. Now, these guys were small-time pirates, 25 crewmen tops, that mainly raided little fishing boats and things like that. And they were caught by an English pirate hunter off the north coast of Jamaica and taken to stand trial for piracy. Now, the story came out in all the newspapers throughout Europe and North America. Imagine two women, living in sin with a bunch of pirates. Boy, you've got sex, you've got scandal, you've got all kinds of stuff. Imagine what the press would do with a story like that today. Well, we don't have to imagine. But back then, this was front page news, and everybody wanted to read about Anne Bonny and Mary Read and Jack Rackham and other pirates. So Charles Johnson published this book, A General History of Pirates, and I'll skip to the bottom, with the remarkable actions and adventures of two female pirates, Mary Read and Anne Bonny, by Captain Charles Johnson in 1724. So is this the same guy that published the book in 1813? Now, in his book, he actually has a drawing of Anne Bonny and Mary Read, and you'll see this in a lot of places. Well, there was a Dutch edition that came out shortly after that, and their portrayal is a little bit sexier than the English version. That's the Dutch. So Charles Johnson was really Nathaniel Mist, and he was a local London author that we know he was the author because he registered his book with His Majesty's Stationers Company, which is their version of a copyright. And before he wrote that, he published a weekly journal, which was kind of like a National Enquirer tabloid that specialized in stories about pirates. So he decided, I'm going to go for the gusto and publish a book. The problem is, there are some accurate facts in that book, but most were just made up and filled in by Charles Johnson, or Nathaniel Mist, because he was writing a bestseller. He published another edition in 1729, then another edition in 1734. None of the stories about Jack Rackham and Anne Bonny are in those. And then he died. Well, in 1813, there was a renewed interest in pirates, so the publishers dusted off that old version, decided to republish it, and added a bunch of sensational stories to make it sell better, including the story of Jack Rackham and Anne Bonny. So I would have to say that one's false. Now let's turn to a very real pirate that very few people know about, William Augustus Bowles. He was born in Maryland, and during the Revolutionary War, he was loyal to the king. So he joined a British Tory regiment and was stationed in Philadelphia. His regiment was sent to Pensacola in an attempt to try and attack the South or attack the southern colonies from Florida. That never happened. While in Pensacola, he got into an argument with his commanding officer and resigned his commission and kind of walked off. Maybe he was trying to walk back to Maryland. At any rate, for the next 2 years, he lived with the Upper Creeks, the Lower Creeks, the Seminoles, the Miccosukee, and the Cherokee. He learned all their languages, learned their customs, married 2 princesses, was inducted into the tribe of the Lower Creeks, the Miccosukee, and basically became a Native American. When the Spanish threatened to attack Pensacola, he returned to the British Army and fought and tried to fight them off, but they lost, and his army was withdrawn back to New York. At the end of the war, he went to Nassau to seek his fortune, trying something new, and made friends with the governor of Nassau, Lord Dunmore. Now, he was a VIP. He had been governor of Virginia and New York prior to the Revolutionary War and was very well connected back in Parliament. So by 1788, he had arranged to send William Bowles with a delegation of chiefs from the various tribes back to London. Now, these people were wined and dined, put up in the best accommodations, taken to the best restaurants, and met with members of Parliament. And it was there the British government hatched a very ambitious plan. There's the United States on the East Coast, and they're constantly expanding westward into Native American territory. There's British Canada. There's Spanish Louisiana. And there's Spanish East and West Florida. Well, their plan was to send Bowles into Florida and let him capture the entire colony and turn it into a Native American nation, a Creek nation, which then would become a British protectorate. Then Britain could come down from Canada, up from Florida, and secure the entire Mississippi Valley. From there, they could expand west and push out the Spanish and take the rest of the continent. I told you it was ambitious. So in 1791, William Augustus Bowles landed in Apalachee Bay, Florida, and started with this operation. He took St. Mark's, which is a small Spanish fort, very easily. And the Spanish offered to negotiate with him. Well, let's negotiate. We can do this peacefully, maybe. And the Spanish sent him first-class passage to Seville to negotiate with the official Spanish government. But as soon as he got to Seville, guess what? They threw him in prison. And he stayed in prison for many years. Eventually, they sent him to Manila just to get him out of the way because his presence in Spain was troublesome. But he managed to escape and made it back to London in 1799. That's where he had his portrait painted, by the way. And he was surprised to find out that by now, England and Spain were at war officially. And the plan was still on. But this time, he would have better support from the British government. This time, he would have pirates. Between 1799 and 1802, William Augustus Bowles secured a lot of Florida and named it the Muskogee Nation, with himself as the leader, with the title Director General. They had their own flag, which is kind of like the cross of St. George from Britain with the Muskogee sunburst up in the corner. Now, he had privateers from Nassau. These were top-rated English privateers, many of them former sailors and officers from the Royal Navy. Great Britain said, we will recognize the nation of Muskogee as allowed to assign letters of marque. And his privateers flocked to him as an easy way to make a lot of money. He had up to 300 ships operating at any one point in time. And the leader of all of these was a man named Richard Powers. The name of his ship was the Muskogee Miko. And for those 3 years, they pretty much controlled the west coast of Florida. Everything in the Gulf of Mexico was subject to be taken by these pirates. Well, privateers. His headquarters was at Miccosukee, which is now a small village east of Tallahassee. And he had a base at the Appalachian Bay, where most of his pirates or privateers would go to take their merchandise and get paid or give them their cut. Cedar Key was vitally important to them. They used that as a base to attack Spanish shipping. A lot of the ships on the way to Pensacola and St. Mark's came very close to the coast of Florida because of the winds, the tides, and fresh water. So Cedar Key was an ideal ambush spot. He made his base on a little island, which is today where the lighthouse is. So if you go into town at Cedar Key, you can't get to his actual base. And they built a watchtower there so they could see ships coming out on the horizon. But there's another spot vital to him, and that's Tampa Bay. You see, the British were sending him lots of supplies, like uniforms, arms, ammunition, money. And they would pay the privateers to drop these supplies off at the entrance of the Hillsborough River, which is right by the Tampa Bay History Center. So you can imagine these tall ships sailing right in here to drop off supplies to be loaded on canoes and taken up the Hillsborough River into the Muskogee Nation. But on March 27th, 1802, England and Spain signed a treaty. And suddenly, the deal was off. England refused to acknowledge their letters of marque, and all the privateers abandoned him. Without support of his pirates, the revolution collapsed. William Bowles was captured by the Spanish and died in prison in Cuba a couple years later. Now, the Louisiana Purchase, everybody knows about that, in 1803, where the United States government bought Louisiana from the French. And pretty soon, New Orleans was one of the biggest boom towns around. Before the purchase, trade had been restricted to only the French or the Spanish. But now, under the U.S. government, everybody could trade there. However, when the war against Napoleon started, the U.S. started putting trade restrictions back on. They were afraid of British and French privateers coming in and taking the town. So the town became a pirate-friendly port. It was the only way the merchants could get goods to sell to all these rich plantation owners. Enter Jean Lafitte, the famous pirate who took advantage of the situation. He built a base on Barataria, which is a little bit to the west of the customs inspection base at the mouth of the Mississippi River. So his ships could go straight to Barataria and then take goods to New Orleans through the backwater and bypass the customs. Now, a lot of people think the U.S. was against Jean Lafitte because he was a pirate. We need to arrest him for piracy. That's not true at all. He always had letters of marque from Simon Bolivar, who was running a revolution in Venezuela. The U.S. didn't care about him taking ships at sea. That was no problem. They just didn't want him smuggling the merchandise in without paying taxes. It was a tax beef that the U.S. government had against Jean Lafitte and his pirates. And sometimes they did pay taxes, just to look kind of honest, but most of the time they didn't. And because it was a pirate-friendly town, when Lafitte's pirates were arrested by the federal authorities and put in jail, the local authorities would release them the next day. Now, a lot of his pirates operated out of Cedar Key also, because it was an ideal spot. It was only a few years after Bowles' pirates had been there, so the watchtower was still there. In fact, the watchtower was there well into the mid-1800s. Now, one of Jean Lafitte's pirates was a man named Louis Michael Ory. There's no evidence that he used Cedar Key as one of his bases. However, there's strong evidence that he was on the other coast of Florida. Now, that takes us to Amelia Island. The local tradition is that Amelia Island was the base of Blackbeard, Jean Lafitte, and Captain Kidd. In fact, when you go there, they'll tell you that at their little museums, and the tourist shop will tell you all that, and all the restaurants will say that that's where they were, and they buried their treasure there. It makes sense, because look, if ships are coming up the coast of Florida, Amelia Island seems ideal as an ambush spot to take those ships. There's even a legend that Blackbeard himself buried his treasure on Amelia Island. Now, this is how the story goes. Blackbeard found a large oak tree and buried his chest beneath the tree and suspended a chain from one of the branches, pointing down to where the chest was. Well, sometime in the mid-20th century, 4 people who knew the legend actually found the tree and saw the chain and knew the story and said, let's dig there. And they had a small shovel and they started digging. And they managed to uncover the top of a chest. But they couldn't get it out. They needed a bigger shovel. So 3 of the guys decided, we're going to go back to the hardware store and get a bigger shovel. And they left. And they left one guy to guard it. Curiosity got the better of him. And he kind of went over to the chest and used his hands and dug up a little bit and opened the top of the chest. And when he did, a big black spirit came swooping out of the chest, grabbed him and carried him off through the woods, dragging him through pricker bushes and cactus and brambles and leaving his body on the beach. Well, when the 3 other men returned with the big shovel, the tree was gone, chain was gone, even the hole they dug was gone. There was no trace of it. Later, they found their friend half dead laying on the beach, who told them about the fearsome apparition. You can decide whether that's a real story or not. At any rate, as far as those 3 go, what do you think? Well, Captain Kidd. Most people think that he was this tremendously pirate with a long history. Captain Kidd only committed 1 act of piracy in his entire life, and that was in the Indian Ocean. It was the wrong ship. It was owned by the Mogul. When he took it, it turned into a diplomatic incident. He was hanged for it. So I would say Captain Kidd never visited Amelia Island or any other spot in Florida. But what about Blackbeard? He certainly passed by a lot, but most of his operations were either in the Caribbean, off the coast of Cape May, which is the entrance to Philadelphia, Charlestown, South Carolina, or in North Carolina. There is no evidence that he ever stopped anywhere in Florida or would have stopped at Amelia Island. Is it possible he buried his treasure there? Unlikely. Because at that time, when Blackbeard was sailing past, it was occupied by Spanish settlers. And if you're going to bury your treasure, I'd pick an uninhabited island to do it in, because your treasure ain't going to be there when you get back. So I would have to say no to Blackbeard. And Jean Lafitte, well, once he established his base at Barataria, he really didn't leave it very much. He stayed back there and managed operations. Possibly some of his men may have used Amelia Island. It's certainly possible. There's no documentation that they did. So I would have to say no to him as well. So where do all these stories come from? Fishermen. Starting in the 1870s, the fishing tourism business exploded in Florida. All these rich people from Wisconsin and New York and Minnesota all wanted to come to Florida and go deep sea fishing. And the guides that told the best stories about pirates got the best clients. And you could see him just up there fishing. Oh yeah, right over there. That's where Blackbeard buried his treasure. So all of these fishing guides in the 1880s up through the 1950s all had stories about pirates. And these stories were told so many times that locals started to believe them. But there is one pirate that did visit Amelia Island, and that's Louis Michel Aury. There's Amelia Island right there on the Florida-Georgia border. And in 1808, it was an ideal spot to smuggle slaves into Georgia. The U.S. had recently forbid the importation of any new slaves. So the only way you could get them into the country was through smuggling. And that's the closest port to Georgia that existed in Florida. In 1811, the Spanish decided to put an end to this. So they established a small town and built a fort. That's a diorama of the town and the fort that they built right on Amelia Island to prevent any type of smuggling activity. That's what it looks like today, and that gun is actually from the original fort that archaeologists found buried in the marsh. Well, Simon Bolivar, who I mentioned before, was running a revolution against Spain out of Venezuela. And things weren't going well for him in 1817, so he had an idea. If I could cause a diversion somewhere in Florida, maybe it might pull some of the Spanish troops away, and I'll have some success. So he hired Luis Michael Ory to kind of be his lead guy in that operation and to sail to Amelia Island to lead some kind of attack. He also paid about 300 Americans to come down from Georgia and South Carolina and be his kind of like mercenary army in the venture. Well, in June, the Americans attacked the fort and managed to capture it, but the Spanish counterattacked and had them trapped on the island inside the fort. But in September, Ory showed up with his 3 ships, and with his firepower, he easily drove off the Spanish. But then instead of following through with his plan, he double-crossed Simon Bolivar and turned pirate and started taking ships himself and smuggling the merchandise into Georgia. Between September and December, he took nobody knows how many ships, but it is estimated that he made about $6 million in profits, and that's $6 million in 1817 money. So that's a lot of cash. Well, on December 23rd, the USS Navy decided to put a stop to it. And the USS John Adams sailed into port and arrested Ory and put an end to all of his pirate activity. And they held him until February, looking for some kind of evidence that he had captured an English ship or smuggled anything into Georgia, but they couldn't find it. He was too smart. So, based upon lack of evidence, they released him. What about the $6 million? No one knows. Might still be there. Who knows? Locals are constantly finding treasure all over the island. In fact, I met a guy in a bar that found lots of treasure, including both of those that he just happened to have pictures on his cell phone, and he shared them to me. So it might be from the pirate days. It might be from the plantation days. No one knows for certain. Now, Black Caesar is another one of those names that comes up associated with pirates all the time. He operated out of Elliott's Key, just south of Miami. His real name was Henry Caesar, and he began pirating in 1804. There are lots of stories on who he was before that. The most believable is that he was a slave on the island of Haiti. And in 1804, Haiti had a slave revolt, and he managed to capture a Spanish ship and turned to piracy. Now, as ships would sail up from Cuba along the Florida coast, he could easily sweep out with his sloop and capture ships as they passed by. It's believed that he had between $2 and $6 million in gold and buried it. Well, where did he bury it? Well, Elliott's Key. But, well, maybe it was Pine Island. No, maybe it was White Horse Key. But then there's Marco Island. He may have been there. Or Sanibel Island. You know, so far, nothing has ever been found of his buried treasure. So I have to refer back to the fishing guides on this one. But he did become partners with José Gaspar, which brings us to our last and most famous pirate of the Florida coast. Infamous José Gaspar. According to the legend, he grew up in Spain, and by 1783 had achieved a very high rank in the Spanish Navy, perhaps admiral, and was assigned to the court of Spain as a naval liaison to the king. While there, he started a love affair with Maria Luisa. Now, that was the king's son's wife and future queen of Spain, so that's risky. But eventually, he broke it off, and she got really mad. So she got the prime minister, Manuel Godoy, to frame José Gaspar as if he had stolen the crown jewels while he was transporting them. Then they went to his house and killed his wife and children. Well, Gaspar was furious and swore vengeance on everything Spanish and left for Florida on his ship, the Flora Blanca, arriving somewhere shortly after 1883. He decided to settle on the island of Boca Grande. Looked like a great place to settle, which he renamed Gasparilla Island after himself. His crew settled on a small island behind him on top of a large Calusa burial mound. Then Black Caesar joined him and settled on Pine Island. But some of his crew settled on Sanibel Island, which may have been named after the girlfriend of his first mate. Then there's the infamous Captiva Island. According to the story, José Gaspar killed all of his captives except the attractive females, which he kept for his own personal harem, and kept them prisoner on a stockade on Captiva Island. Captive, get it? But there's a catch. He only had room for so many. So each time he added a new female to his harem, someone had to die. Pretty shocking, huh? And then there's Giuseppa Island. According to the legend, he fell in love with this young Spanish princess named Josefa. But when she refused to return his affection, in a fit of rage, he drew his sword and cut off her head. Then he felt so bad about it, he buried her with full honors on that island and named it after her. Now, actually, that island was named Josefa Island in the early 1800s. Giuseppa is kind of like a mispronunciation. Then he became partners with Jean Lafitte when Jean Lafitte left Galveston. Now, over his career, he may have stolen $30 million, which he had buried in 6 locations on Boca Grande. But in 1821, the United States had acquired Florida, and he knew it was only a matter of time before the U.S. Navy would come in and rout them out of there. So his crew started slowly leaving and disbanding, taking their share and bugging out. Black Caesar left. And by the spring of 1822, Jean Lafitte was the only one of his pirate captains that remained with him, along with about 80 men. Well, this was their last day on the island. They were sitting around having a big party, drinking rum, enjoying themselves. We're going to leave the island tomorrow and split up. And suddenly they saw a merchant ship passing by, very close. It was too good to be true. They could not resist the temptation to take just one more ship. So they left 10 men behind on the island to guard the treasure. And then the 2 crews, the remaining 70 men, 35 on each ship, hurried to make their ships ready to sail, set sail, and cruised off after this mysterious prize that looked so tempting. The Flora Blanca was the first to catch up and fired a warning shot across its bow. That was a mistake, because the ship raised the stars and stripes. It was really the USS Enterprise, a warship in disguise. And Gaspar had fallen for the trap. After the flag came up, the gun ports flew open, and a devastating broadside rang shot through the decks of the Flora Blanca. After a short battle, Gaspar knew it was only a matter of time. So he tied an anchor to himself and jumped overboard, saying, "Gasparilla dies by his own hand, not the enemy's," and sank into oblivion. Jean Lafitte, seeing this, horrified at what he just saw, sailed off, but didn't get very far. Another U.S. warship caught him up by Manatee River, and his crew were forced ashore and disappeared into the Florida jungles, never to be seen again. Well, there's lots of problems with that narrative. Let's talk about some of them. First of all, the USS Enterprise was a warship in the anti-piracy squadron, but was always stationed around the waters of Cuba, and was in Cuban waters at the whole time where we were supposedly fighting José Gaspar. And there is no logbook entry in the USS Enterprise of them ever fighting a pirate like that or anyone named José Gaspar. Furthermore, there's no historical evidence that José Gaspar ever existed at all. They've searched the records in Spain, but they don't find his name anywhere on the naval rolls, certainly not in court. There are no people that have been captured by him or taken that went back and reported Gaspar. There is no record of him in any U.S. Navy warship logbook. Plus, on a 1774 map, we see the island is already named Was Gasparilla over a decade before he was supposedly got there. So that doesn't make sense. And what about Black Caesar? Well, if he was Black Caesar's partner, well, there's no historical record that Black Caesar ever existed either. In fact, the earliest record they can trace to Black Caesar is from a fictional book titled Black Caesar's Clan that was published in 1921 by Albert Payson Traherne. So it appears this story is not what it seems. And what about Jean Lafitte? He was real enough. But during the time when he was supposed to be with José Gaspar, he was well documented. He had a base on Mujeres, which is next to Cancun. Nice place to be a pirate. And then, between February 22 and May of 1822, it's well documented he was on Cuba. In fact, he was even in a Cuban prison in February of 1822 for a short period of time. So that's not true. So what is the truth about José Gaspar? The earliest record of anybody named José Gaspar appears in 1822 in a newspaper that was published in Pensacola. And it mentions a small-time pirate named José Gaspar operating on St. Bartholomew Island that was captured by the U.S. Navy. Now, St. Bartholomew is a long ways away from Florida. And there is no record of what happened to him after that. Now, there's a fascinating story that I learned from your museum curator about an article that came out about Jean Lafitte and José Gaspar. Now, according to this article, which is fiction, when Thomas Jefferson bought the Louisiana Purchase, he needed to make a down payment of $3 million to the French government. But he couldn't do it openly because Congress hadn't officially approved the deal yet. So he had to find some way to smuggle $3 million in gold to the French government. And he hired two pirates, Jean Lafitte and José Gaspar, to do it. Now, the story is certainly interesting. It's got all this government intrigue and going back, president bypassing Congress and pirates and all that kind of stuff. But it's not true at all. It was a fictional story. In fact, the down payment of $3 million was satisfied by the U.S. assuming some of the debts of France. Then there's another guy named Ricardo the Mystic, who is a vaudeville hypnotist. And in the early 1900s, here in Tampa, was running a scam where he would hold a seance, and people would pay and attend this seance to talk to the ghost of José Gaspar and find out where his treasure was buried. The authorities put an end to that. But the real turning point was in 1904, when the city of Tampa decided to have a May Day celebration with a pirate parade and pirate ball. Now, they thought it'd be cool to have pirates because everybody loves pirates, and they invented the mystic crew of Gasparilla to host the whole thing. And they came up with this pirate, Gasparilla. That time they didn't call him Jose. At least I had find that in print. There's the newspaper article that was published on May 10th, 1904, that talks all about the ball and who wore what and the king and all this fluffy stuff. Now, Edwin D. Lambright was on the writing staff of the Tribune and was also a member of Ye Mystic Crew of Gasparilla. And he decided to write a backstory on who this pirate was. So he came up with some of the information, but it wasn't very complete. Meanwhile, in 1907, a phosphate mine was built on Boca Grande. And the Charlotte Harbor and Northern Railroad built a spar to get the phosphate out. Well, when the president got there, he just fell in love with the island and decided he's going to go into the real estate business too. And in 1911, they built a luxury resort hotel that called the Boca Grande Inn that was going to be open for railroad executives. And he was going to sell real estate too. But then in 1913, he decided to open the inn to the general public and renamed it the Gasparilla Inn. Now, the timing was perfect because that was the same year that Tampa decided to make the Gasparilla Festival a standalone event and move it to February. There's the article that came out in the newspaper, Gasparilla Day, to be greatest event of its kind for the city. And it talks all about how now this is not part of the May Day celebration, but it's now the Gasparilla Festival. So the president of the railroad, Robert Bradley, saw a great marketing opportunity where he could publicize both events simultaneously. Remember, he's a railroad guy. So people coming to the Gasparilla event buys railroad tickets. People to go stay at his inn buys railroad tickets. And that's what he was interested in. So to publicize his inn, he hired a man named Pat Lemoyne to write a detailed backstory of José Gaspar. Now, no one knows what the original brochure looked like. All of those are gone. I kind of made that up just to show you what it might have looked like. But he came out with a brochure advertising the hotel with the entire backstory, with Captiva Island and the captives and the princess and the cutting off of heads and all of that was in his story. Now, he attributes Panther John Gomez as the source of his story. Well, you got to have a source, right? He was one of those fishing guides on the 10,000 Islands. And an interesting thing about Panther John is in the census before he became a fishing guide, he lists his birth date as 1828. Now, he died in 1900, which would have made him 72 when he died, reasonable age. But as soon as he started telling stories about pirates, he said that I was one of their crew. I was there. So he changed his birth date to 1776 in the official records, and then sometimes 1774, then sometimes 1785. It varied. And he changed his birthplace from Portugal to France to Mauritius Island, then back to Portugal, depending on whatever pirate story he happened to be telling that season. Now, there is no evidence that Panther John Gomez ever mentioned the name of José Gaspar. He may have, he may not have. But he was a perfect subject source as this is where I got the story. And according to Pat Lemoyne, Panther John was one of those 10 men left behind on the island when Gaspar went to capture the ship. So he was there. He was one of Gaspar's crew. He had been with Gaspar since 1800 and saw it all. Then the entire brochure was published in the Tampa Bay Times on February 1st, 1917. And who was Gasparilla? This is how we know what that first brochure said. And it even attributes the Charlotte Harbor and Northern Railroad as its source of the document. Many years later, actually 1949, Pat Lemoyne was giving a lecture, and he was talking about him writing. And he said the whole thing was a cockeyed lie. He took all these stories that he thought would appeal to tourists, put it in his narrative of who this José Gaspar was. Now we go to legitimacy. In 1924, a scholar named Francis Bradley was writing a work. He was a Boston historian, writing a work, Piracy in the West Indies and Its Suppression. And most of his source documents were from the U.S. Navy logbooks, so they were legitimate. Well, he was golfing buddies with Robert Bradley of the Charlotte Harbor and Northern Railroad, who gave him a copy of that brochure, and he printed it in his book without changing a single word. And with that, the legend of José Gaspar acquired legitimacy. And many people cite that book as proof that he was a real guy. So, we've talked about the pirates of Florida, lots of them, and I hope you enjoyed this class. Now, with that, do we have any questions? Yes?
So when the pirates and the privateers, when they attacked the other ships, did they mostly kill the ones in the ships, or did they recruit them to be pirates?
The question was, if a pirate or privateer attacked another ship, what do they do with the crew? Did they kill them, or did they recruit them? It depends on what time you're talking about. During Blackbeard's time, it was bad form to harm the other crew. Almost no one was killed. They were all well-treated and let go. And of course, they recruited from their crew, but it was all voluntary unless you were a doctor or a musician, which they needed, and then you were forced to go. Later on, when we get into the 1820 time period, it got a lot worse. When pirates were more tried as criminals, then they were killing everybody they were taking. Yeah. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Your attire, is that true?
Yes. I always wear authentic attire. This attire is what someone would have worn in 1670. So I'm the Robert Searle pirate here at this time. This style, the waistcoat, the kind of boots, and everything, the sash was very common in those days. Even the hat, which is made out of beaver felt. And if you feel it, it's like really rough. Beaver makes the best hats because it's waterproof. It's like 15th century Gore-Tex. And even a sword with a shell hilt would have been something very popular to the 1660s. I actually have pirate outfits for all of the different time periods. I have to pick which one I want to do, and I figured, well, let's go with a Robert Searle look today. Yes, ma'am.
When we were in Nassau, there's a big house on the top of the hill right there off the harbor.
Mm-hmm.
And we had lunch there, and their story was that the man who had built the house was a pirate, and he had been operating out of that area. And the government, I guess the governor came to him and said, enough, you either turn legitimate or we're going to throw you out of the country. So he turned legitimate and built those businesses. Do you notice that?
Kind of. The way it worked, up until June of 1718, Nassau was a pirate town, run by pirates. There was no law. There was no governor. The Royal Navy decided to put an end to it. So they sent 6 warships and Woodes Rogers to become the first governor of Nassau. The 6 warships arrived. Woodes Rogers, who was a former privateer, so he was one of them. He was a privateer during the War for the Spanish Succession. Said, everybody here can accept the king's pardon as long as you promise not to be pirates anymore, and you can stay. And if you don't sign the king's pardon, we'll hunt you down. Most people signed the king's pardon. Some didn't. Yes?
We have a question from one of our online participants.
Yes.
Is it true that pirates often had talking parrots on their shoulders? And where did that myth come from?
Parrots, that came from a book, Treasure Island. Parrots are very annoying pets to maintain. If anybody's ever had a parrot, and I never have, but my mother's friend had a parrot, and so I would say that there is no more likelihood that a pirate would have a parrot than anybody else in the world. Lawyers, bankers. Some people bought pets, and parrots certainly were popular because they were transported over from South America. I would think a much more likely pet for a pirate would be a monkey. They get around on the ship a lot better, and they're a lot easier to take care of. But Long John Silver had a parrot, and ever since then, boy, every pirate has a parrot.
We have one last question from our online participants. How did you choose where you got your information from, and how did you decide between fact and fiction in your research?
Excellent question. I basically bought every book and read every article that I could find that was out there. And once you've done this a while, it's very easy to tell what doesn't make sense. Because a lot of these, the bad books are copies of other bad books. So you're reading this and goes, wait, I read that before. I read that in this book. And that's the same thing that's in this book. Okay, when you start knowing the real history, you can quickly tell what's fake and what isn't fake. That's the best way I can describe it. But I've been researching this for like 13 years. Yeah, I think the next book I'm going to write is Blackbeard's Treasure, where Blackbeard may have buried his treasure. And I am now of the belief that Blackbeard actually did bury his treasure. I wasn't for a long time, but I changed my mind. Yes?
I think you said that there was a storage area around Cuba, and then they come up the...
Florida Straits, yes.
Yeah. Where did the treasure come from that was being stored in Cuba?
Some of it came from the Aztecs in Mexico. Some of it came from the Incas. Some of it came from all of the silver mines in Bolivia. A lot of it came from the Philippines, all the pearls, jewels, things like that that would come across from the Philippines. And basically everything of South America and the Philippines would go to Panama. Then it would be taken across the Isthmus of Panama on mule caravans and then transported eventually to Cuba, along with everything that came from Veracruz and Maracaibo, which is the big port in Venezuela that sent a lot of riches up there too.
All righty, well, thank you very much once again, and thank you all so much. Just a couple of quick notes. You all, I know, enjoyed today's Florida Conversations. We do them every month in the fall and winter into the spring. So next month, February 16th, mark your calendars or go online to tampabayhistorycenter.org. But February 16th, we have Dr. Antoinette Jackson talking about African American Burial Grounds and Remembering Project, which is something she is the head of at USF. March 16th, Suncoast Empire, Bertha Monroe Palmer, her family, and the rise of Sarasota. So for Women's History Month, we're talking about Bertha Palmer. And then April 13th, as I'd mentioned, in conjunction with the Cuban Pathways exhibit, we are going to have a panel on Cuban pathways. We also have a duck wall lecture planned for June. And we've got a bonus Florida Conversations planned for late April. And so just check out the History Center's website for that information and everything else.